Welcome to American Constitutional History 1, History E 1650. I am Professor Allison, and what I would like to do as a way of starting is talk about this quote. Can everyone read this? My handwriting is pretty bad, I know. So what does it say? This is good. We almost did this in unison. All men would be tyrants if they could. What does it mean? Without laws, the people would use their power. Okay, that's an interesting way of putting it. Couldn't laws be tyrannical? Couldn't people make laws that are tyrannical?
Man's nature.
Excuse me? Man's nature is to be a tyrant. It's kind of a bleak thought, isn't it? A bleak observation. Do you think this is true, then? Okay, does anyone not think this is the craziest thing? Yes, sir.
I don't think it's the craziest thing I've ever heard, but I don't think it can be applied across the board to the whole.
So there are some men who wouldn't be tyrants if they could. Okay, well, that's a fortunate thing, I suppose. Can you think of any examples? I mean, I didn't mean to put you on the spot. You're bold enough to raise your hand and offer a contrary opinion. I mean, we can think about it. Yes?
Probably Abraham Lincoln, the Roman, they call him...
You're obviously not from the South if you think Abraham Lincoln wouldn't be a tyrant. Okay. Yes, sir.
It's not exactly refusing tyrannism, but George Washington declined from being king.
There's an interesting idea. George Washington declined opportunities. You were mentioning some Romans, too, and I know my knowledge of antiquity isn't very extensive, but yes, okay. And you had a thought a minute ago? Gandhi, okay. Wouldn't have been a tyrant even if he could. Does anyone know who said this? Has anyone heard it before? Yes?
I have heard it, but I don't.
Okay. Anyone want to guess? Thomas Paine. Good guess. Who was Thomas Paine?
He's the patriot who wrote Common Sense.
Patriot wrote Common Sense. Okay. That would be a good guess. It's not right, and I'm sure he may have said this at some point to somebody, because this was a fairly commonplace phrase. If they had bumper stickers back in 1776, you probably would have seen this on a number of them. You have a guess?
Shakespeare?
Shakespeare. No, it's not Shakespeare. Again, a reasonable guess. We have kind of a big range in time now. If Thomas Paine had said it, it was probably already a hackneyed phrase, which means it's before then. I don't know if Shakespeare ever said this, but he's not the person to whom it's attributed. Anyone have any other guesses? We're narrowing it down. This is impressive. This is, I think, the fastest a group has narrowed this down or come up with reasonable guesses. Anyone else have a thought on this? John Locke. Another possibility. Again, right in the middle of Shakespeare and Thomas Paine. I like the way your mind is working. John Adams. Well, that's an interesting guess, because you can buy greeting cards that the Freedom Trail Foundation publishes with this quote on it, and they attribute it to Abigail Adams. She did actually write this in a letter to her husband. This famous letter she wrote, "Remember the ladies, when you come up with your code of laws, remember all men would be tyrants if they could." And she doesn't want the new laws to put tyrannical power in the hands of husbands, which the old laws did. It's a very interesting exchange, and this is, I think, the reason Abigail Adams is regarded as this crusading feminist, because she wrote this playful letter to her husband. Again, there's more to Abigail Adams than that. She didn't coin this phrase, though. But you can see, when she is using it, it does mean something somewhat different than if John Locke had said this or Thomas Paine had said this. She's meaning all you men, and Locke, Paine, whoever did say this, was meaning all of us. I don't know if he would have said all men or women would be tyrants if they could. Does anyone think women would also be tyrants if they could? Good. I'm seeing women nodding, which is a reassuring thing. Okay. Any other guesses on who said this? It's kind of interesting you mentioned John Adams. I first came across this quote in a pamphlet written in 1798. Not written, published in 1798. Published by a guy named James Lyon, who was a printer up in Vermont. And the book, this was a little blurb in the front of, was a book about the Prophet Muhammad. Kind of interesting. Why is someone in Vermont republishing a 1697 English biography of the Prophet Muhammad, a book written by a guy named Humphrey Prideaux? By the way, probably not only during the rest of the semester, but I suspect during the rest of your lives, you'll never again hear the name Humphrey Prideaux, so you don't need to remember it. But here you have this biography of Muhammad written by Humphrey Prideaux. Did anyone know anything about him? You know, I might have stumbled upon the Humphrey Prideaux authority in the room, and here I'm dismissing him out of hand. He apparently was an English clergyman in the 1690s, and he wrote this biography of Muhammad not because he was really interested in the Prophet Muhammad, but because he was warning people in England about the dangers of having free thinkers running around, because what's going to happen is some religious tyrant like Muhammad will come along and squash all of that free thinking. He was worried about the liberal nature of English youth. They were doing all kinds of crazy things apparently in the 1690s, things that I advise our youth today not to do, and the consequence would be religious tyranny, which Humphrey Prideaux and others thought would be a bad thing. But this isn't why James Lyon is publishing this book. It's one of these real puzzles. Well, interesting, I suppose, if you're an historian with lots of time on your hands, to figure out why someone is publishing this book. Anyone know anything more about James Lyon, Vermont publisher? At the time he published this book, his father, Matthew Lyon, bless you, who was a member of Congress, was in jail for violating the Sedition Act. Sedition Act passed during the administration of John Adams to prevent people from writing, uttering, or publishing anything that might bring the president or a member of Congress into disrepute. Okay? So Matthew Lyon, member of Congress, writes a letter to his constituents saying the Adams administration is an unceasing quest for power. And Adams loves ridiculous pomp and parade. And Matthew Lyon winds up in jail for writing to his constituents that he thinks Adams is questing for power. Right enough. He should have gone to jail, right? Okay, so again, here you have Muhammad doing much the same thing, apparently, back in Mecca whenever he was running around as here John Adams. You know, he started off with this idea of liberty. Remember, John Adams was the Colossus of independence, the foremost voice for independence in 1776. Here as president in 1798, he's throwing people in jail who criticize him. So I think that's what James Lyon meant by putting this little preface to his biography of the Prophet Muhammad. By the way, if you're interested in the details of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, don't start with Humphrey Prideaux's book, because he's writing with a much different message, just as I think James Lyon is publishing this with a much different message than, boy, are you interested in learning about the Prophet Muhammad? No, you're interested in what's happening today. Okay, so we've established, though, that this wasn't John Adams or Abigail Adams, although Abigail Adams did say this and Adams knew about it. Just to spare you more of this game, anyone have any other guesses, people they think might have said this? Okay, so you have this in James Lyon's book, and he gives a source. Abigail Adams doesn't have a footnote in her letter because she doesn't need to. Everyone knew who she was quoting. And there's more to the quote, actually. Nature has left this tincture in the blood. All men would be tyrants if they could. And then it goes on. Not kings alone. Not ecclesiastic pomp. No, I'm sorry, ecclesiastic pride. Okay, so, you know, we can all picture a king being a tyrant, some religious establishment becoming tyrannical, but that's not all. But parliaments, and every man beside. It's a longer poem. Had I known it would be this interesting, I would have memorized the rest of it and could have recited it, and we all could have discussed it. But look at this. Not kings alone, not ecclesiastic pride, but parliaments and every man beside. Even a parliament, which in the 16th and 17th centuries was regarded as the apex of liberty, can become tyrannical. Has anyone figured out now who wrote this? Not Cromwell. Oh boy, Cromwell would be a good one, since here you have the prime example. He leads this revolution against kingly authority, sets up the Commonwealth with the Parliament calling the shots, and then he becomes the Lord Protector and then the dictator, and then wants to install his son after him. Something we'll be talking about in a few minutes. So is he warning that even Oliver Cromwell, this nice guy with the nicely shaven head, could be a tyrant? I don't know. Have you ever heard anyone running for office and saying, I might become a tyrant if you don't watch out? It might be refreshing. I don't know if we would vote for him. Anyway, or her. Any other thoughts? It is someone well-known, a well-known English writer. Yes? Not Blake. He's a little later, but another good guess. All of these are good guesses, incidentally. No one has made a crazy guess yet, so despite all the temptations to do so. So, Daniel Defoe, and it's kind of an interesting thing because it's one of the few things Defoe wrote where he used his own name and wanted people to know he wrote this. And it's just as Humphrey Prideaux isn't really relevant to our discussion, why Defoe wrote this isn't particularly pertinent. He wrote it in a pamphlet called The Kentish Petition. And I'm not really familiar with all of the details of this case. 1700, 1701, 5 guys from Kent draw up a petition to Parliament for something, and they try to present it to Parliament, and Parliament doesn't like what they're saying, so they arrest them and throw them in jail. So, kind of an interesting story. You have the representatives who don't want to hear what these people are saying, so lock them up. And this strikes Defoe as being really wrong, and he writes this pamphlet denouncing Parliament's treatment of the Kentish petitioners, and at the end he has this long poem which has these two couplets in it. Nature has left this tincture in the blood. All men would be tyrants if they could. Not kings alone, not ecclesiastic pride, but parliaments and every man beside. It is a pretty serious warning. Now, you're still dubious about whether this is true? I'm sorry, were you the one who was dubious earlier? You are still dubious. Okay, good. It's good to have contrasting opinions, and I don't know. Again, we can think, is Defoe going to have footnotes saying, well, not every case, or, what about Cincinnatus, or he wouldn't have known about George Washington, but it's a warning. And as I said before, this is one of those phrases that would have been on a bumper sticker in the American colonies in 1776. It's something everyone knew, a catchphrase that people simply took for granted. And Locke wrote it in 1701, actually in the midst of one of the most interesting periods of political debate in the history of the world. Very interesting period. Some of you mentioned some of the characters who were involved in this particular period of controversy. John Locke. What did John Locke write? Treatise on Government. Didn't he write 2 of them? 2 treatises on government. Have you read them? Has anyone else read Locke's treatises on government? Because Locke is perhaps the one guy we remember. Has anyone read Locke other than this young lady and this gentleman? Okay, a couple of... By the way, if you raise your hand, I'm not going to start grilling you about, well, what is Proposition 13 in the Treatise on Government? I'm just curious who has read it and who hasn't. He didn't sit down one day and say, what someone really should do is write a treatise on government, and I have some spare time, so I am going to write one. I don't know if any of you have ever done this, thought, gee, I really should write a treatise on government so people will understand what government should be. Do you remember what Locke thought government should be? he wrote this because someone else had written a pamphlet about government with which Locke disagreed. A guy named Robert Filmer. Has anyone read Filmer? Have you read Filmer? Okay. Filmer wrote... No one's read Filmer? Has anyone here never heard the name Robert Filmer before? Okay, good show of hands. Now, I'm not going to ask someone else who has heard the name, raise your hand, and I'm going to start grilling you. Who was Robert Filmer? He wrote about his concept of what government was. His concept of government was it's like a family. And his book was called Patriarcha. Just as a family has a patriarch, that's like a father, the nation has the father in the king. And just as the family functions by everyone doing what the patriarch tells them to do, at least that was the case in Mr. Filmer's family. I don't know how it is in your families. I'm always embarrassed to mention this to my wife. Everyone does what Dad says they should, and this is how these guys are leaving in protest, at going home to reassert their Okay, great. Patriarchal authority is how families work. Patriarchal authority is how the nation works, and thus we have a king, everyone should listen to him. And Locke writes in response, that's not the way governments work at all. That's not the way states are organized. People make a contract with the government to be governed. And patriarchal authority is for the birds. Okay? He doesn't say it so eloquently. He actually gets into more legal terms than I have. So you have Locke and Filmer entered into this debate about the nature of government and the nature of the state. Very important debate. And again, they're not writing in a vacuum. They're writing in the midst of a big constitutional crisis in England. Someone mentioned Oliver Cromwell before. Just to tell you what happens in 17th century England, you have kings. Charles I runs afoul of Parliament. There wasn't any clear understanding of what Parliament was supposed to do, what the king's role was supposed to be, and Charles I and Parliament disagreed about whose job was what, who had sovereign power, who was supposed to call the shots in England. And what happens in the 1630s is Parliament arrests Charles I, tries him for treason, and cuts off his head. How's that for kingly authority, for patriarchy? Okay? So you have Parliament saying, we don't need a king. We're going to establish a commonwealth. Where the power is held in common by all of us, at least all of us in the House of Commons. We don't need a king. Now, Charles I had friends, okay, who were sore about him losing his head, and Parliament manages to make some mistakes, which means there are people saying, gee, maybe having Parliament calling the shots isn't such a good thing. And in 1660, Charles I's son, Charles II, is restored to the throne after about 20 years of having Parliament running things. Charles II recognizes he's a smart politician. Okay? He can't simply order people around. Parliament is a factor in the government of England. Charles II has to deal with Parliament, or he might lose his head. He doesn't want to simply tell Parliament, okay, keep calling the shots. No, he is the king. The king has a role in this. So after 1660, there is a period of negotiation between king and Parliament about who should be doing what. And Charles II is smart enough to learn how to get along with Parliament. And this is all happening. This is why people are writing all these pamphlets about government, because there are all these arguments about what government should be doing. Did you have a question, or are you just shaking your... Okay. So, if you do have, anyone doesn't have a question, or you want me to stop, raise your hand, and I'll stop and let you ask a question. Or if you have something you know I've said is wrong, okay? So, what happens then? Charles II's younger brother James becomes king, and he is less able to deal with Parliament for a number of reasons we don't need to get into today. and James II winds up alienating Parliament, and they don't cut off his head, but they do kick him out, depose him. And Parliament then does something really interesting. They call a new monarch. They say, okay, we've recognized we do need a monarch, so let's get one. And the new monarch actually has two monarchs, a husband and wife. The wife is James II's daughter, Mary. And Mary becomes the queen. Her husband, William, who is a Dutchman, becomes the king. But before they do, they have to agree that Parliament will be running things, okay? That they have a Bill of Rights. There are certain things the king and queen can do, certain things they can't do. Parliament is calling them in. So if Parliament is the body that tells someone he or she can or cannot be king, Parliament has a great deal of power. This is all happening at the end of the 1600s, in the midst of this big political debate going on with folks like Filmer and John Locke arguing about the proper nature of government. There are a couple of other characters we should mention, too, just because they're really interesting. Has anyone read anything by Thomas Hobbes? Yeah, more people have read Hobbes than Filmer. What's Hobbes all about? Great Hobbes line. I don't know, you might find it on a bumper sticker today. Life is nasty, brutish, and short, which kind of gives you a glance into his outlook on life. Hobbes believed in a big, strong state, because otherwise people are going to try to kill one another. There'll be anarchy, unless you have some countervailing force that can prevent people from tyrannizing over each other in this brutal world. His book was called, anyone know what his book was called? Leviathan. A leviathan is a sea monster, and this is his idea of the state. Okay, sea monster. Big, powerful, sinister, force that will prevent us from killing one another, which is what we would do if we had a chance. Not too much different from what Mr. Defoe was saying. All men would be tyrants if they could, but I don't think they would have agreed on a lot of other things. If you look at the cover of the first edition of Leviathan, what you see is the image of the king. I should have brought a copy along. Ignacio, did you bring a copy of Leviathan with you? Okay. Okay, so you see this image of the king. You know, it's with a crown. You look closely, see the image is made up of lots of little faces. So the idea here is the king actually is the sovereign power, but it's representative or embodying everybody in the nation. Very interesting concept, put very eloquently on the front page, so you don't need to read the whole big, tiresome book. Okay, so you have this story, Hobbes warning us about human nature being this evil thing, and it needs a force that will counteract it. And then you have Locke, who has, I suppose, a sunnier view of human nature, although he's not a real optimist, saying that the state is going to become tyrannical. People enter into a contract with the state, and the state will do certain things, and they will obey it, but only up to a certain point. And then there are lots of other things being written in this same period. Now, all of my discussion of the way Parliament and the king were negotiating lines of authority in the 17th century, brings to mind a pretty important question. Actually, we are going to be getting to what all this means as far as the American colonies in a minute. Has anyone here seen the United States Constitution? Okay, where did you see it? In Washington, D.C. You go to the National Archives, and there it is, right? Now, has anyone seen the British Constitution? I have had students tell me they did see it. Why hasn't anyone seen it? It doesn't exist. It's not written down anywhere. It is whatever Parliament determines it to be. Okay, so it's a moving target. This is how Parliament gets away with saying, okay, now we call in the king and queen. There isn't a document that sets out what the role of the king will be, or the queen, what the role of the prime minister will be. In fact, in this whole period we've been talking about, there was not a prime minister. That's something that happens in the 18th century. Happens actually for a couple of reasons. As I mentioned, Parliament calls in James's daughter Mary to be queen, and then she dies. Her husband William reigns as king for a while. He dies, and then James's daughter Anne becomes queen, and then they're kind of stuck because James doesn't have any more descendants. So what do? Where do you find a king? It's not a problem any of us have had, I suppose. Go to Holland. Well, not Holland. That's where they went before, and that worked out pretty well. They go to Germany because James's grandson is a German prince. This is one of the problems if you're in a royal family. Say you're the royal family of England. You can't have your children marry one another. They have to marry someone else who is royal, but there's only one royal family here. So they have to marry out. They have to marry someone from another country, and because there was this whole Protestant Reformation, one of the things that William and Mary had to agree to is no Catholic can ever be the monarch in Great Britain. It's one of the reasons I don't get too nostalgic about the whole English Civil War and so on. Anyway, someone want to be king? Okay. So James's grandson, George, was a prince in Germany, the Elector of Hanover, and so they call him to be king. And he comes over, and he is king of England. Problem for George is he doesn't speak any English, and he doesn't really want to be king of England. He was happy in Germany, but they insisted. So he actually spends half of his time in England, half in Germany, attending to his duties as Elector of Hanover, and all of this dealing with Parliament isn't something that interests him very much, so he prefers letting other people manage Parliament. And he decides, okay, I'm going to have advisors. How about if my chief advisor actually is a member of Parliament who can get things done in Parliament? And so that's what happens. And then his son, George II, whose English is a little better than George I's, does the same thing. Rather than meddling in the affairs of Parliament, I'll have someone, a prime minister, who's a member of Parliament who can get things done. And the first English prime minister, anyone know who the first English prime minister was? See, not 5 minutes into the class and someone was able to tell me who the first president of the United States was. First English prime minister? No. There's actually a town in Massachusetts named for him. This usually starts people guessing. Not Westminster. That's a good guess, though. It does begin with a W. Not Westford, not Worcester. Yes. Walpole. Very good. Walpole. Robert Walpole. And he is a member of Parliament. The king makes him his prime minister, which means he can get things through Parliament. And the way he does this, actually, if he wants people to vote his way in Parliament, he appoints people they know to offices, or even them. He'll appoint to offices. So he rewards them. They call this patronage, by the way. You give someone a job, and they'll vote your way. So Walpole does this with great effect in the early, mid-18th century. Okay, so this is the system that's emerging in England, but there isn't a document that says, this is what we'll do. We'll have a prime minister who will be a member of Parliament, but the king will appoint him to do stuff. No one had thought that far ahead. It's a system that emerged, and Parliament continues to change the rules because Parliament is the judge of things. Now, this is what we know because we can look at this and figure out how this system works, but it's not necessarily the way people thought it was working in the 18th century. There's another political theorist I should mention because he's quite important in the whole history of political theory. By the way, I'm not really interested in political theory, and I am interested in politics and how things work and why things happen and why people do certain things. Is anyone here a political scientist, by the way? Because this is my first warning that I'm not a political scientist. Second warning, I'm not a lawyer. And if you came here hoping to learn constitutional law, you're really out of luck. I mean, I can tell you what Chief Justice Marshall said about something, but I advise you not to go into court armed with that only. French guy named Montesquieu. Has anyone read Montesquieu? Okay. You have any thoughts on Montesquieu?
It was like 6 or 7 years ago.
6 or 7 years ago, yeah. So like, yeah, I'd advise, every 6 or 7 years, maybe you should reread, maybe every 8 years, okay? Okay. Montesquieu, he wrote a number of books. The main one, written in the 1740s, was called The Spirit of the Laws. And he was trying to figure out what made laws work. And he was a Frenchman, as I mentioned, and he looked around the world and observed that there essentially were 3 different kinds of governments. Now, those of you who are more familiar with the ancient Greeks, particularly Herodotus' book about, the Greeks and the Persians, will realize this is kind of old hat, but the 3 different kinds of governments. There are tyrannies. And he wasn't necessarily meaning this in a negative sense. Defoe clearly means tyrants are bad, okay? But Montesquieu is just putting down, this is a kind of government. You have one person who calls the shots, a despot or a tyrant. And this kind of government, he said, works best in a big territory because you need to be able to do things with dispatch. So empires typically operate through tyranny. And he uses examples the Ottoman Empire and the Chinese Empire. Now, he knew as much about either one as an educated Frenchman of the 1740s would, which means not very much. But he kind of thought he knew, just as Humphrey Prideaux thought he knew all about Muhammad. Montesquieu writes about how the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire has absolute power. Everyone is afraid of him because he can lop off their heads in an instant. And this kind of was a popular European idea about the way the Ottoman Empire worked. He also said the same thing about the Chinese Empire, which actually isn't the way these 2 places worked, but our course isn't either how Montesquieu got it wrong or how the Ottoman Empire worked. It's about the American Constitution. So just leave it that this is what many educated people like Montesquieu thought. And the empire operates through the power of a tyrant. The tyrant holds his power through fear. Everybody's afraid of him. Okay? So that's how you'll do what he says. On the other hand, he is also afraid that one of his janissaries, these are the Turkish soldiers, is going to decide, hey, I'd much rather be the Sultan myself than simply carry out his orders. So one of the janissaries is going to lop off my head and become the Sultan. And I didn't mean to make myself the Sultan suddenly. You see how quickly it happens. Defoe was right. You let me talk to you and suddenly I'm your Sultan. So that's fear. And it works both ways. Everyone's afraid of him. He's afraid of everyone else. There are certain advantages to this system. It have large area. Things can get done quickly, and so on. Okay. Next, he said, tyranny operates through fear. Aristocracies. And this is, you have princes with estates. And Germany, for example, you have these German princes, like the Elector of Hanover. They get together with the other princes, and they have a reciprocal relationship with their subjects. And it operates through their honor. That is, they have a certain role in society. Now, my colleague here, Don Ostrowski, teaches world history and tells me there was no such thing as aristocracy and the feudal system in the way we think of it. So that kind of puts the kibosh on poor Montesquieu. On the other hand, had Montesquieu been aware of how the Japanese system worked, he would have said, yes, this is an example. You have the daimyo, who are princes in a local principality who every year would get together in Edo and decide what we all would do, and they set this culture, and they set trade policy, and so on. Essentially, Japanese trade policy was not to do it with anyone else. So you have an aristocracy that is sustained through their honor. This is also what prevents one of these daimyo from deciding, I would much rather be emperor, or actually, it does happen in Japan, I'm sorry. One of the daimyo does decide it would be better to be the shogun and run everything than simply be one of these princes. But it's this sense of honor that keeps them from killing one another or deciding, hey, this gentleman's going to set himself up as the emperor over everyone, which could happen, incidentally. Each of these governments has within it the seeds of its own destruction. So aristocracy works through honor. And then finally, last form of government, anyone know what it is? Yes. a democracy. Or he used the word republic, I think. Again, it was in translation. But yeah, this is, and he said, okay, tyranny can have a huge area, an aristocracy, somewhat smaller area, but still bigger than a democracy or a republic, which can only operate in a small area where people have a common interest. Because if people have too many different interests, they're going to kill one another. So he saw as examples of democracies, well, the Dutch Republic, a small trading state where everyone had this common interest in trade, works in a small area, couldn't work in a bigger area because he couldn't get anything done if people have to vote on everything. So it's impossible, Montesquieu said, to have a republic over a large area. It will either have to be an aristocracy or a tyranny. Now, to us, it doesn't really matter if Montesquieu was right or wrong. And the way our conversation is going, more like the way my monologue is going, I think he was wrong about a lot of things. What does matter is most thinking people in the world we will be talking about thought Montesquieu really knew what he was talking about. This does explain how governments work. And a democracy or a republic remains one because of the civic virtue of the people in it. Okay, now, Montesquieu takes this a step further, several steps further, actually. In addition to setting out what these forms of government are, and again, Montesquieu does have a particular axe to grind here. He's not simply saying, gee, it would be really nice if someone explained the spirit of the laws. He's living in France, in which there is an absolute monarch. There are these really ineffective local parliaments, but no real system to check the monarch, and he's hoping France will adopt something like this. And he sees within each of these different governments problems where a democracy can devolve into anarchy or someone can set himself up as an aristocrat. An aristocracy can also degenerate or become a tyranny, and a tyranny has all of the problems I know we all can imagine. Montesquieu sees one system that he thinks is perfect because it combines all of these things. And that way, each one prevents the other from devolving into the thing it should not become. And that system is, anyone know? England. Imagine this, a Frenchman looking across the English Channel saying, they've got it right. So you have the tyrannical force represented by the king. He represents the whole nation. He is able to do things. But he is checked by the House of Lords, representing the aristocratic nature of the system, and the House of Commons, representing this common interest. So you have a balance of these different governments in England in this system that was emerging in the 18th century, and Montesquieu thought this was ideal. This is what other countries should try to do, to balance these different forces. He also stressed something he thought was very important. This system works, he says, because the powers of these different branches are kept separate. That is, the House of Commons does not have executive power. The House of Lords does not have the power of the House of Commons or of the monarch. The powers are kept strictly separate. Now, what I just said earlier about the Prime Minister, who's the Chief Executive Officer, being a member of Parliament, should be enough to let you know that Montesquieu also didn't know what he was talking about when it came to England. Makes us wonder why I've just spent 20 minutes talking about him. But he thought this is the way the system worked in England. It didn't. But the system he was describing is very much the way the American colonies were working. And now this is what, this is why I've spent all this time talking about this. Because a system had emerged in the American colonies that makes Montesquieu's book have really a deeper resonance here than it did in England. Anyone in England can read this and say, this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. The Prime Minister runs everything, and he does it by appointing people to executive offices, and he's a member of the legislative body. But what had happened in the American colonies is this. Beginning in the 17th century, these colonies had been created by corporations in England, and they all had a charter which set out what the governing structure would be. So this is a very important distinction between the British system, because here you have charters, a piece of paper that explains what the roles in the government will be. Now, what happened in virtually all of them was this. The Massachusetts Charter of 1691 says, for example, there will be a governor who is appointed by the king. This is the case in just about all of the other colonies. It's either the king or the proprietor, the person who owns the colony, choosing a governor. There also will be an assembly. And here in Massachusetts, the assembly is chosen by people in the towns, in their town meetings. The town meetings are democratic bodies. They happen at least once a year. Has anyone here been to a town meeting? Okay, a couple of people have. And you don't believe people will become tyrannical even having been through a town meeting? Okay, I'm sorry. So the assembly, chosen by people in the towns. The job of someone in the assembly is to look out for the interests of their town. So if Fitchburg sends someone to the assembly and the person says, well, Fitchburg isn't that important, they're going to send someone else. The governor's job is to make sure Massachusetts is in line with British policy. He does represent the empire. So here you do have two different interests, and they're going to clash. In fact, though, for most of the 17th and 18th centuries, they don't. They get along pretty well because the interests of the towns of Massachusetts and the British monarch are pretty much the same. But we recognize they're not always going to agree. You don't go back to the Fitchburg town meeting and say, well, what the king wants or what the empire wants is really not in our interest, but we have to go along with it. Well, we'll talk next time about what happens when that particular turn of events comes about in the 1760s and 1770s, and it's not a happy thing. But what you do have here are a governor. You also have a council, but the council's typically chosen by the assembly to advise the governor because the governor isn't from around here. His job isn't to make you happy. His job is to make sure things here are in line with the interests of the empire. So since he's not from around here, he needs our advice. The assembly will appoint a council to advise him. And this functions as an upper house. But they're not aristocrats. In fact, there really aren't that many aristocrats here in North America. There are some rich people, but there isn't the really severe gradations of wealth that you have in England at the time. So the upshot of this is, you have this big political debate in England in the 1600s, 1700s, and you have Montesquieu weighing in on the structure of government. Parts of the English political argument have much more resonance in North America than they do in England, because they describe a world that is closer to the world of North America than they do to the world of England. So people like Filmer or Hobbes, who are writing about the need for a strong state to prevent you from killing one another, don't have the same appeal here for a variety of reasons we don't need to get into. People like Locke, or someone we haven't mentioned, Cato. Actually, this was a pseudonym. One of the things you would do if you're writing a pamphlet is to take some name from antiquity. And Cato's letters were written by two guys in the 1720s, Robert Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, warning about executive power, the power of the monarch. People in England regard Cato's letters as being on the lunatic fringe. People in America say, that makes sense, because here we do have governors who represent executive power, and they may wield their power unwisely. And you'll look through the records of the various American colonies and see quite often a conflict with the governor who is vetoing something the assembly has tried to do. Some governors are more effective than others, then as now. So you have this constant argument, and you have factions developing within these different colonies, really about local issues, not about some grand idea, but really about local issues. And the governors try to navigate this, but since they're not from around here, they often run into trouble. But Cato, with the warnings about executive power and entrenched power, people here get. In fact, it would be hard to find a library in any of the American colonies where you don't have at least one copy of Cato's letters. This is like a textbook, as is Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, with its warnings about the dangers of these different kinds of power, and particularly the plea for a separation of powers. And these books, these political arguments, describe this world that had emerged in these American colonies by the middle of the 1700s, where you have a governor, an assembly, and a council. Yes, were you going to ask something? Okay. So you have then in England this big political argument in the 17th century, which culminates in Charles I losing his head, the establishment of Parliament, the restoration of the monarchy, and then this settlement in the 1680s, 1690s, and then the development of the office of Prime Minister, all done without a grand scheme and without a written guide to it. And then you have this very different set of systems emerging in the American colonies where there's a tremendous degree of local control. Town meetings, or a House of Burgesses in Virginia, that are the governing force in that particular place. It's a system that worked very well. And there wasn't really a check from England other than the hands of the governor. And if the colony didn't like the governor, they would ask the king to replace him, send someone else, which often happened because the interests of the empire were served by people here pretty much doing what they were doing, without the Parliament interfering. Things start to go wrong in the 1760s, which is something we'll talk about later on. But the important thing to remember as we're discussing all of this, and as we're discussing the development of the American Constitution, is that it's something that comes out of experience. An experience people had had here with systems of government and with attempts to change the system of government. It wasn't these systems in the colonies weren't created with a grand plan, but simply as a way of getting something started. And the system that emerged in England also was done without a grand plan, but simply emerged through experience. And then the great events of 1787, 88, and 89, the creation of the United States Constitution, come out of this experience people had had, an experience resting on this long political argument from the 17th century, and out of the experience people had had with the constitutional systems or charter systems before 1776, and then the experience during the War for Independence of having state constitutions written, revised, and trashed, and having a federal system created that didn't really work. We often imagine, well, maybe we don't, maybe just some people do, the guys who wrote the Constitution sitting down with a copy of John Locke and figuring out how this thing should work. If you had that image in your head before, throw it out. If you didn't have it, I'm sorry for introducing it, because it's not the way the Constitution was created. It came out of painful political experience. And that's all for this hour. When we come back, I will have some things to say about the rest of the semester. So we'll take a break at this time, and when we come back, I will talk some more.